Hello students, welcome to Target IAS. This is a part of series of video lectures covering economy related current affairs targeting Prelims and Mains 2021. In this video, let's discuss economy related current issues covering from January 7th till January 13th. Let's begin. This article discusses how GDP contracted this year when compared to the previous year. In the fiscal year of 2019 and 20, we could see a GDP growth of 4.2%. But in this current fiscal year, which is 2020 and 2021, the financial estimates revealed that GDP will contract a 7.7%. When the GDP of current fiscal year is compared, the first quarter GDP contraction was around 23.9%, and the second quarter in the previous financial year GDP contracted around 7.5%, which resulted in a GDP contraction of 15.7% in the first half of the fiscal year 2020-21. Whereas in the second half, the GDP was contracted around 0% or 0.1%. So when these two halves of the GDP contraction is combined, the budget estimates reveal that 7.7% of GDP contraction can be estimated for the current fiscal year of 2020 and 2021. Now let us look at several indicators which resulted in the GDP growth rate. Now, there are certain positive factors as well as negative factors influencing the GDP contraction rate this financial year. Now, the positive sectors include 3.4% of GDP growth in agriculture sector and 2.7% of growth was recorded in the sectors of electricity, water supply, gas and other utility service providers. Whereas the sectors of transportation, hotel, tourism and broadcasting resulted in a downfall or negative growth of 21.4%. Whereas the sectors of construction, mining and quarrying recorded a 12.6% decline. And in the manufacturing sector recorded a downfall of 9.4%, which resulted in the overall contraction of 7.7%. This article concludes by saying that India recorded India will record a negative growth for the first time since 1979 to 80. Coming to the next article. Let me give you a brief idea of what World Food Price Index is all about. Now, this World Food Price Index is used to measure the monthly changes of international prices of certain basket of commodities. Now, these basket of commodities are cereals, oilseeds, dairy products, meat and sugar. So, the main or principal aim of this food price index, which is measured by the Food Agricultural Organization, is to monitor developments in agriculture sector. A base period of 2014 and 2016 is taken while recording the food price index. It was initially started in the year 1996. Now, the price of goods not only provide an important indicator of the food consumption but also as income of certain farmers and producers. Let me explain. This particular index acts as a measure between the agricultural production and market demand. See, for example, if the prices are high, it affects consumer demand. It will lower consumer demand. For example, if a kg of onion costs 100 rupees, we will try to reduce the demand or we will try to reduce the consumption of that particular commodity. So, increase in prices result in reduction in consumer demand, whereas increase in prices will result in the income of farmers and producers. This World Food Price Index influences this farmers' income and consumer demand. By doing that, it also influences hunger, dietary cycle and undernourishment of a particular country. Now this article here states that barring sugar, prices of all these commodities, oil, cereals, dairy products and meat has raised for a consecutive 7th month, which resulted in higher food price index. Now, when majority of people in low and middle income countries are employed under agriculture sector, so in that scenario, this World Food Price Index gains relevance. This article here discusses certain measures that have already taken by the RBI and certain other measures which are to be taken by the RBI. Now, because of COVID-19 pandemic, RBI has introduced an expansionary policy. Under this expansionary policy, RBI resorted to reduction or slashing of interest rates and amounted or pumped liquidity into the economy, also assisted to the distressed sectors. Now, in order to ease restrictions or in order to bring an economic recovery, RBI during the lockdown or during the pandemic resorted to these expansionary policies. Now, it reduced or slashed interest rates, it pumped liquidity or money into the economy to support economic activity, and it also instituted a slew of measures to help distressed sectors in the economy. Now that we could see a revival in the economic activity, RBI may want to bring or may want to exit from this easy money regime. Now, what are the challenges that RBI can face while making this withdrawal? The first big challenge is to maintain inflation. The main or the biggest challenge that RBI has to face is to maintain the balance between increased inflation and support to the economic recovery. Now, even though the inflation rate has been high, it has been on the higher side of the RBI's target, RBI is not able to cut down its or are not able to increase its interest rates in order to maintain or in order to give a boost to the stability of the economic recovery. Now, RBI expects or Monetary Policy Committee expects inflation to come down on its own now that the supply chain disruptions in the economy has come down. Now, there are certain factors that resulted in the higher inflation. The first factor is consumer expectations. Now, because of the pandemic, consumer expectations regarding inflation were high, which means the general psychology or general mindset in the population is the prices will be high. Now, that is the consumer expectations with regard to the inflation. Now, because these consumer expectations in relation to the inflation remains high, the inflation rate in reality will also remain high. So it is like directly proportional. Consumer expectations are directly proportional to the rising inflation. Now, the second point is excessive margins. Now, many firms have lost their income or profits during the lockdown. So in order to compensate those losses, many firms will want to increase their prices. So increase in prices leading to increase in inflation. Now, the other factor influencing the inflation rate is core input. The increase in input prices result in increase in inflation. There are also certain other factors. Like, for example, many households resorted to saving during the lockdown period. Now, the tricky thing here is because of the lowered interest rates, these people who saved their money in the form of investments were not able to receive higher interest rates for their savings. And the last factor that influences inflation is the uneven or unequal distribution between larger firms and smaller firms. While larger firms were gained after this pandemic, smaller firms continue to be in distress. So all these factors is directly or indirectly influencing the rise in inflation. Now the second biggest challenge that is faced by that will be faced by the RBI is excess liquidity withdrawal. Now that the economic recovery is happening, RBI may want to withdraw excess liquidity that was previously pumped by the RBI into the economy. The problem here is with the announcement of this kind of policy may influence a panic attack to the private sectors or any firms in the economy are used to this excess money in the economy. Now that if RBI announces that it is going to withdraw all the excess liquidity from the economy, they may fear that they may lose their investment or support from the government. So this is another challenge that RBI may face with its exit from the easy money regime. Now the other problem that RBI may face is maintaining rupee value. With the rise and fall of export and imports, and with the more fluctuations in the export-import business, the rupee value may be appreciated or depreciated beyond the limits. So all these factors, this trinity of factors, RBI has to be conscious while making decisions, because this with liquidity withdrawal and capital outflows and rupee appreciations or depreciations cannot be managed all at once. So this article concludes by saying that it is better to be rough right, as Keynes said. Keynes is a British economist. He said that it is okay to be roughly right than be precisely wrong. So that should be the guiding principle for the RBI as it navigates its way out of the crisis-driven easy monetary policy. This particular article discusses in the price fluctuations, or basically increase in prices of one particular industry, that is steel industry. So now automakers are announcing that they may resort to increase steel prices. Now the factors that are influencing the increase in steel prices are three. The first factor is increase in input prices. The second factor is demand. And the third factor influencing the price rise of steel is decline in productivity. Now, the major raw material of steel is iron ore. The global price of iron ore, the raw material iron ore, is increasing nowadays. The 1 ton of iron ore costs around $170, which is way more than $100 it was previously. So this increase in input prices result in increase in steel prices. Now the second factor influencing the price rise of steel is demand, especially from China. Now China especially focuses on its construction activity. Because of increase in construction activity, the demand for steel is more for China. Now China imports most of its iron ore from India and Australia. Now exports of iron ore from India increased from 19.1 million ton to 40.7 million ton from the year 2019 to 2020. So in the year of 2019, India exported 19.1 million tons globally, and in the year of 2020, India exported 40.7 million ton of exports globally. Of this 40.7 million ton, around 38.1 million ton was exported to China. The other point here is China imports almost 60% of its iron ore from Australia. Now that there are increased tensions, geopolitical tensions between Australia and China, there is a reduction in this particular imports from Australia, iron ore imports from Australia. So it is more relevant now for India to export more iron ore to China. Now, because of this increased demand and shift in the countries, it resulted in increase in iron ore cost, which automatically resulted in the increase in steel costs. Now, the other major factor influencing the increase in steel prices is decreased productivity of iron ore. Especially from the mines of Odisha, there is certain decline in especially from the mines in Odisha, there was a decline in productivity, which resulted in further increase in prices of steel. Coming to the next article, this article here discusses the major 3 factors that are influencing the economic recovery. Please excuse me for this article, it is not so much clear, so I have cut and clipped these individual points here for your better clarity. So now, according to this article, as I said earlier, there are 3 distinct forces that needs to be disentangled. Now, the first point discussed here is the virus proliferation. Now, India imposed one of the strictest lockdowns in all of the world. So because of that, we could control majority of virus proliferation, thereby bringing down the coronavirus cases. Now, because of that, we could see a jump in economic activity. Around 95% of the economic activity, when compared to that of pre-pandemic levels, has resumed its functioning. Now, this is a positive factor while taking into account the factors influencing economic recovery. Now, there are a couple of other factors that may influence in economic revival. They are changes in unemployment. Although we could see an increase in economic activity, according to this article, around 18 million unemployed people when compared to pre-pandemic levels are still present in the economy. So, it accounts to around 5% of total employed. So, the other factor that confirms the increase in unemployment is the increased number of jobs under MG-Narega indicates that they've otherwise lost their previous unemployment. So, this increase in MG-Narega acts as an indicator for increased unemployment otherwise. The interesting part here is this labor market pressures may lead to medium-term or long-term risk. Let me explain. Now there is economic activity or economic revival in the economy. Basically, these economic revival come from the larger firms. So the consumption or demand or capital production will lead to a short-term growth revival, but not in long-term. Because right now the economy is driven by profits and capitals, but not by labor and wages. Hence, we could see a rebound in the short term. But in the medium term and in the long term, this rebound may affect because of the pressures in labor market. Now, it is quite evident that the pandemic has affected more to blue-collar job holders than white-collar job holders. Otherwise, labor or manual labor has affected more than the white-collar individual. The third factor influencing the economic recovery is large firms versus small firms. Now, after the lockdown, many large firms could go back to their normal activity, but not smaller firms. So this uneven or unequal distribution of incomes or the economic activity between the larger firms and smaller firms also influence this economic activity, because majority of economic activity in the India comes from the informal sector, which are small and medium enterprises. So now the temporary increase in economic activity now is because of the increase in larger firms activity, but not the economic activity from the informal sector. So in order to gain long-term benefits, government needs to ensure that the economic activity is coming from both the larger firms and also from the smaller firms. Now, all these factors led to a K-shaped recovery. Now, this K-shaped recovery is happening not only in India but also globally. Now, let me explain you a scenario regarding households by taking a pyramid. Now, during the lockdown, the top 10% of households resorted to saving their incomes for future consumption. Now, but the bottom population of households or the bottom communities Now, the bottom community were not able to invest their money in savings because of loss of jobs and loss of savings for consumption. So, this bottom layer of population this bottom layer of households resolved to this bottom layer of households spent all their money to consumption, while this top layer of households resorted to savings. This bottom layer resorted to consumption. Now that the pandemic, this happened during the lockdown, but now the economic activity is going on a full force. The top 10% of households resorted to 20 to 35% of consumption. However, this consumption is only of short term but not of long term, because these 10% of households are using their saved money from the lockdown to spend for their consumption. Now, because of this, we could see a increase in consumption or demand in the market. Now that after the savings are over, maybe this 10% of households will not resort to further consumption or demand, thereby reducing the whole demand in the economy. But the lower group of households or poor income households who occupied the lower levels in the pyramid will not resort to any consumption or demand, because they've already lost their jobs and they're not in a position to increase demand by spending money. COVID-19 also affected or increased the distance between the incomes of this top layer and the bottom layer. Now, all these factors have to be analyzed. All these factors Now, this article concludes by saying that government needs to make a conscious decision keeping all these factors in mind before presenting a budget, which will give a major push for the physical and social infrastructure, thereby bringing down the unemployment by increasing jobs and economic activity in the economy. This article discusses certain measures which are considered by the Union Finance Ministry. Now, these ideas are still in discussions and not implemented in a full force. Now, according to the Union Finance Ministry, the government spending is Now, according to the Union Finance Ministry, government needs to spend more now at the stage of recovery than earlier, which will give a bigger push to the growth. Now, Also, the ministry is advocating the Keynes Mantra. As I've already said, Keynes or John Maynard Keynes is a British economist. Now, according to this economist, public spending is more relevant than private spending in a situations like this. Now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic activity in all of India has come down. This is also holds true for the global economy. Now, in these conditions, private sector also experienced a dent in its revenue. Now, even though the economic activity is rebounding, it is not possible by the private sector to invest high in the economy. So, it is the government's duty to increase public expenditure to increase the infrastructure and thereby increasing economic activity. So, in short words, Keynes Mantra advocates that, so according to Keynes Mantra, it is the government's responsibility to increase expenditure or increase public spending, and it is not up to the private sector to invest in the economy. So there is one more interesting idea put forth by the Finance Ministry. Now the idea says that Finance Ministry may resort to debt to GDP ratio as primary target of fiscal policy. Now we've already discussed what debt to GDP ratio is. It basically is the amount spent by the government by the income of the government. So the idea of the Union Finance Ministry is to shift the fiscal policy target from fiscal deficit to debt to GDP ratio. Until now, we are following fiscal deficit as primary target of fiscal policy. Now, the target or the fiscal target of the current financial year was 3.3%, but the fiscal deficit of 2020-21 was reported to be 3.5% of GDP. So here, this article states that fiscal deficit target is 3%, but the actual fiscal deficit estimate was 3.5% of the GDP. Now, this article also states that higher spending will mean higher growth. So, higher spending by the government will act as antidote for economic activity. While the combined debt of center and states was 72% for the previous financial year, it is expected to touch around 85% of the GDP. The combined debt of center and states will be or is expected to touch around 85% of the GDP in the current financial year. Now, in this backdrop, Finance Minister has resorted to shift the primary fiscal policy from fiscal deficit to debt to GDP ratio. So, the present budget will be more of an expenditure budget than revenue. So, now this article here states that the present budget will be more of an expenditure budget than a revenue budget. So the areas where ministry is keen to increase spending are healthcare and construction related activities, be it infrastructure or housing. So public spending in these activities have a huge trickle down effect and benefit many industries from cement to steel, besides creating durable jobs. So the Union Finance Ministry is aiming to increase its spending in the areas like health and infrastructure. Now, the increased spending in these certain areas will have a trickle down effect. Now, trickle down effect is when you invest in higher levels, it will automatically comes to lower levels. So increase in investments in construction sector may increase or may benefit steel industry or cement industry. So government is of the opinion that increase in spending of these certain sectors will bring a trickle down effect, thereby increasing economic activity and also bringing down unemployment by creating more jobs. So with this point, I'm winding up today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please go back to video and make separate notes of the points which are related to mains and make separate notes for the points which are related to prelims. I hope you all enjoyed it. This is Dr. Spurti signing off. Thank you. Happy studying.